11:00. Continue. Welcome everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Katya Malinova. I am the moderator today. It's good to see you all, and we have a great pleasure of having Vincent Maurin present to us this design of central counterparty. Vincent is going to talk for about 45 minutes as per usual. John, his co-author, is unfortunately not able to answer your chat questions. You're still welcome to put questions in the chat and we'll present it to Vincent when we get the chance, but also please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions throughout the seminar. And Vincent, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much again for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Katya, for the introduction, and thank you very much for having the paper in the seminar series. So the paper is called Design of Central Counterparty, and this is joint work with John Kuong, as Katya said. But I see John in the audience, so you can maybe ask questions in the chat. I should say that John is based in Singapore, so it's a bit late for him. So maybe you shouldn't trust everything he says in the chat, though. So we're really happy to be able to present this paper in front of this audience because, as you can see, the topic, design of a central counterparty, is very related to market microstructure. So in front of this audience, I feel like I don't even need to motivate the topic, but I'm still going to go through the first slide. As you probably know, many financial contracts, such as swaps and derivatives, are traded bilaterally in over-the-counter markets. Now, since the global financial crisis, there has been a push, mostly from regulators, to promote the central clearing of these contracts. So if you look at interest rate derivatives, the fraction of cleared contract has been multiplied by 4 over the last 10 years. And the EU, you also have repos that are mostly centrally cleared. So I'm sure most of you know that, but what does it mean to clear centrally a contract? Well, it means that a trade will be novated to a central counterparty, to a third party that is called the CCP. So you start with a contract between A and B, and then you're going to novate the contract, which means that the CCP will stand in the middle, become the buyer to the seller, and the seller to the buyer. Now, this small change can have important consequences if you think that in these markets, for derivatives, there is some counterparty risk. And in a sense, in this paper, we're going to argue that to think about the design of the CCP is basically to think about default management when a member of the CCP default. So let me be a bit more precise here. So think about this trade between A and B, right? And it's any centrally cleared contract, and you have the CCP in the middle. Now suppose that A is in default. Now, presumably the CCP will have collected some collateral from A in order to be able to repay B. Now, you could do that already in a bilateral contract. So what is the CCP really bringing to the picture? Well, what a CCP can do is that it can use its own resources or the resources of other members of the CCP to compensate investor B here. So we're going to argue that the key benefit of central clearing is to mitigate counterparty risk via the mutualization of losses. This is not the only benefit, but this is the benefit we're going to focus on in this paper. Now, what are the costs? Well, one cost that practitioners often talk about is the cost of collateral. CCPs require a lot of collateral. And indeed, they require collateral to protect others against your default. You can think about initial margin, but they also require collateral to make sure that these investors in green here, the M, actually make their contribution to the default fund, right? So one cost is the collateral cost. Now, another potential cost is that this mutualization of counterparty risk might actually weaken market discipline, right? In this case here, investor B doesn't care so much about the creditworthiness of investor A because the counterparty becomes the CCP. Okay, so there might be a negative effect of mutualization of losses on market discipline. So what we do in this paper is that we're going to take this trade-off into account, and we're going to ask 3 main questions. So first, obviously, when is central clearing optimal? And by that, we mean optimal with respect to a purely bilateral contract. Now, provided that it's optimal, how much do you want to mutualize losses between CCP members? And now the third question, which we think is very important, is should the CCP agent contribute to this loss allocation process? And if the CCP contributes, by how much? So how do we do it? Well, we have an optimal contracting framework, and we're going to view the centrally cleared contract as an optimal multilateral contract. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that. Now, this optimal contracting framework will also allow us to endogenize the CCP's agent compensation. And you will see that this will have implication on the loss mutualization process. What do we get out of this? Well, first, we're going to find that central clearing does not always dominate a bilateral trading. It's going to be the case if the market size is large, which is probably intuitive, but we're also going to show that the benefit of central clearing are unshaped in the cost of collateral. And later on, I will tell you exactly what we mean by the cost of collateral. But for now, you can think about the liquidity premium that some assets like cash and treasuries that are widely accepted as collateral will command over other assets. Now, the second result is that although we have a fairly abstract contracting framework, we're going to find that our contract rationalizes several features that you see in central clearing. And by that, we think about initial margins and default fund contributions that are both pre-committed and exposed, right? Now, what we think is the main contribution of the paper is the third bullet point. What we're going to have in this paper is a theory for the CCP agent and a role for CCP capital. Remember what I said is that central clearing and mutualization of losses can maybe weaken market discipline. So here we're going to have sometimes the CCP emerge as an optimal central monitor of all the members. Right? And the reason why the CCP might be good at that is related to the endogenous economies of scale in monitoring that you have in Diamond, for example. Right? And of course, we're going to explain how it works in this specific context. Now, what we think is even more interesting is that because of its role as a central monitor, the CCP will be incentivized in a specific way. The CCP will have a junior first loss equity claim in the loss allocation process. This equity claim will serve as skin in the game. And as I will argue by the end of the talk, this is exactly what we see in practice. All right, so I think if there's any question, now is a good time before I go into the model. Okay, I see there's some activity in the chat, so maybe I'll let John, handle this.
Yes. Pete Kyle. Pete, did you want to voice your question?
I think, yeah, I'll do it. I had two questions, actually. The first one is that you said that the collateral and central clearing is liquid assets that has a kind of liquidity premium that implies the cost. But why can't you have illiquid assets as collateral?
That's a good question. So we're not taking a stand on that. So you will see that in the model there is a cost of using collateral. Then it seems that in practice most of the CCP will accept very liquid assets such as treasuries or even cash as collateral, and they will not accept riskier securities that might have higher returns. So you can think of, we take that as given in this framework.
Okay, my next question was to be protected, you have to be a member of the central clearing organization. But in practice, you have customers of the investment banks that are members of the central clearing, and the central clearing does not, I understand it, necessarily protect the customers. So what are you assuming about, or how are you building the welfare of the customers into your analysis?
That's a very good point. And the short answer is that you can view our analysis as not distinguishing between customer and dealer, right? So we're aware, as you say, that there is a tiered structure in clearing. So you have dealers that are participating in the clearing arrangement, and then they have customers. We're gonna mix the dealers and the customers into one batch here. So we're aware that this is there, but this is not going to be in this current paper.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other question? Okay, so of course there's a literature review, but I will come to it at the end. And now I'm going to jump right into the model. So you'll see it's a fairly simple model where you have two dates, 0 and 1. And at date 1, you have two equally likely states of the world, L and H. We're going to have two groups of N investors each that will also be indexed by the state. So H investors and L investors. Now, these two groups of investors will gain from trade because they want to hedge some endowment risk. Right? So as you will see here in this paper, we're really interested in clearing. We're not really interested in the specifics of the contract. So we're going to capture these gains from trade in the most simple way that we could think about. So in particular, if you're H investor, you prefer to consume in state S, right? And we capture this with the following preferences. Note that if you're S investors, you have regular preference, except that in state S, you get an extra kick from consumption. In particular, your marginal utility of consumption will be equal to this parameter nu, that is higher than 1, until you reach that level C hat. So you can interpret that level C hat as the demand for hedging in this state. Now, the reason why you have gains from trade is because these S investors, they prefer to consume in state S, but they own an asset that only pays in state S prime. Here you have the payoff of this asset. As you can notice, there's another thing that is important about this payoff is that conditional on the state S prime, which is when the asset pays off, the asset only pays with probability Q, right? There's asset payoff risk, and we're going to assume that this payoff risk is idiosyncratic across S investors. As you can maybe anticipate, what we want to capture here is the notion of idiosyncratic counterparty risk in over-the-counter market, right? I trade with a counterparty, and there might be some counterparty risk attached to it. If we didn't have this feature, it would be fairly easy. You could match everybody bilaterally, and you could realize all gains from trade simply with bilateral contracts. So we need this basic feature to generate gains from mutualization. This is the basic environment. So now I'm going to introduce the frictions. So the first friction is that we're going to introduce a limited asset pledgeability friction, right? So investors are going to make payment out of the asset that I just talked about, but this asset will not be fully pledgeable. We're going to capture this with this parameter beta tilde. And what it means is that a promise to repay more than beta tilde per unit of asset is not credible. So we model that in a very stylized way using the framework of Holmstrom-Tirol, but we think it actually captures something about trades in over-the-counter market. So let's think about the following. Suppose that I buy a CDS contract to get protection from John. If John only sells me one contract, I'm fairly confident that he will deliver. Now, if John sells for 100 million notional of contracts, I'm a bit less confident that he will deliver, right? So we try to capture this notion of Fourier risk taking with this really reduced form parameter. Now, there's one thing you can do to mitigate this pledgeability problem, is to use cash collateral. In particular, at date zero, investors can liquidate any fraction of their assets to get some cash. Right? Now, as we already talked about, using cash collateral will be costly because there's an opportunity cost K. So what is this K? This is the difference between the expected return of the asset that you initially own and the return of cash, which has a gross return of 1. Right? So using cash collateral will be costly. You can think about that again as treasuries that are accepted as collateral have lower returns than other assets that you would otherwise own. Now, one benefit of cash collateral is that it will increase your pledgeable income. Why? Because cash can be pledged as collateral and it's going to be more pledgeable than the asset. So if you liquidate part of your asset, your pledgeable income will go from this beta tilde, which is the pledgeable income of the asset, to this number here, which is higher than beta tilde. Right? Now, there's another thing that you can do to improve this pledgeability problem is that investors can be monitored. Right? If an investor is monitored, this costs psi, and then the pledgeability of the asset of this investor will be equal to beta. If the investor is not monitored, there's a probability 1 minus alpha here, then the asset of this investor is not pledgeable. So 2 remarks at this stage. First, I didn't say who is monitoring the investor. And this is because we will consider 2 different monitoring schemes. I will talk about it on the next slide. Second, you might think, okay, this monitoring business is a bit abstract, right? This is not corporate finance here. Now, what we're going to argue toward the end of the talk is that, in fact, in the context of central clearing, CCPs do a fair amount of monitoring of their members. So for now, I'm going to ask you to bear with us with this abstract formulation, and later on, I'm going to try to convince you that this is actually relevant. The second friction will be related to this monitoring technology. We're going to assume that the monitoring effort and the outcome is not observable. Okay. Now, the last building block of the paper is the CCP agent, right? So who is this CCP agent? Well, it's a third party that is initially endowed with some capital E at date zero. Here you have the preferences of the CCP, and what's important is that the CCP prefers to consume at date zero because this parameter nu C here is strictly above 1. Right? You can think about nu C minus 1 as the cost for the CCP to pledge capital. Right? 1 unit of capital pledged at date zero requires a compensation of nu C at date 1. We're going to make one assumption about this cost of CCP capital. We're going to assume that it's not cheaper than collateral. Why do we compare these two? Because at the end of the day, CCP capital and collateral are two safe resources that can be used at date zero. So we don't want to give an advantage to CCP capital. What it means here is that CCP capital will be suboptimal as a tool to insure investors, at least compared to collateral. Now, I just want to advertise here that in the new draft, we relax this assumption, and we're going to see that in general, anyway, it's a bad idea to use CCP capital in order to insure the members of the CCP. If I have time, I will come back to this thing in the conclusion. Now, then, what can the CCP do? Well, the CCP agent will be able to act as a centralized monitor. And as you will see, eventually, we will compare two monitoring schemes: bilateral monitoring and centralized monitoring by the CCP. So what I'm going to do now, before telling you about the optimal contract, I'm first going to tell you what is our contracting framework, right? Because we're going to take an approach that you might not expect, but we're going to argue that our approach actually allows us to get back to a centrally cleared contract. What am I talking about here? Well, in practice, we think about centrally cleared contract as follows. Two counterparties meet, they sign a contract, and then they clear this contract. Of course, what you expect is that the fact that this contract is cleared will have an impact on the terms of trade in this contract. So what we're going to do instead is that we're going to solve directly for the optimal multilateral contract between the investors and the CCP. Right? At a high level, how do we think about this contract? Well, you have transfers at date zero, investors will post collateral, and the CCP will pledge capital. At date one, you will have transfers to and from investors, and the CCP will maybe get some compensation. So here we stop short of introducing the general notation in the paper, because I'm going to argue in the next slide that we can actually focus on a simplified set of contracts. But just for illustration, I'm going to show you how it works with a picture. We are at date zero. You have two investors of each type, two L investors, two H investors, and the CCP in the middle. Right? Now, at date zero, the investors will post collateral to the CCP, X units, and the CCP will pledge capital, EC, here. Right? Suppose that at date one, state H realizes. Right? In state H, these H investors on the right, they will get a positive transfer, so we call them receivers. The L investors, they will get a negative transfer, so we call them payers. Of course, this is symmetric. In the L state, that will be the opposite. The fact that this L2 guy here is in red means that is in default. Now what happens? So first, payers make payment. So the defaulting guy will actually have to pay exactly the collateral that he posted, right? Doesn't have to be, but we're going to show it's optimal anyway. The non-defaulting payer here will make a payment P and will get the collateral back. Okay. Now you have the total resources of the CCP, and the CCP will use these resources to pay the receivers, some transfer R, and maybe to keep some compensation pi C. Okay. Now, these transfers can depend on a lot of things. Why? Because conditional on state H realizing, the default of this L guy here is idiosyncratic, right? So you have as many states as there are outcomes in terms of default and success of these payers, right? So I'm just saying that to say that the optimal contract could be fairly complicated, but I'm going to show you on the next slide that it's not that complicated. One assumption is going to help us for that, although it doesn't really change the economics. We're going to assume that ex post, one successful payer, so here just L1 out of L1 and L2, has enough resources to cover the hedging needs of all the receivers. You have N receivers, their hedging need is C hat, so you need N times C hat. As you will see on the next slide, it will mean that the only real aggregate risk that investors need to face is the risk that all the payers default at the same time, both L1 and L2. Hopefully that will become a bit clearer on the next slide. Okay, so this lemma will tell you that we can consider a simplified set of contracts. And this contract will tell us two things. First, about the payment of the payers, and then about the transfers to the receiver. So first, maybe not surprisingly, it's optimal to confiscate all the collateral X of a payer who defaults. Right? If I punish more this payer when he defaults, I'm going to be able to extract more from this guy when he doesn't default. This is done in order to maximize pledgeability. Right? Now, what about the receiver transfers? As I said, the transfers to the receivers can depend on a lot of things. The point here is that the receivers, given the way we specify preferences, are risk averse, right? So you want to minimize the variability of that transfer. So first, the receiver will get RS if the counterparty succeeds, a fixed payment RS, right? Now, if all the payers fail, there's no payer out there to make payments. So the only resources available are the pre-committed resources, the collateral and the CCP capital, right? This is what I said, that receivers, ultimately, they are still exposed to the aggregate risk that all payers default. Okay. Now, if you had a bilateral contract, this is more or less what you could do, right? Your counterparty succeeds, you get a payment. If your counterparty defaults, you're just stuck with the collateral. That's the only thing you can get. Now, if your counterparty fails, but at least one payer succeeds, in a multilateral contract, you're going to get this amount RF here, right? Now, you might ask, okay, why don't we set this RF equal to the RS? Why do we want to expose an investor to the risk of his or her counterparty? The intuition here is that this exposure to counterparty risk can be good to encourage bilateral monitoring. If you want investors to monitor their counterparty, you want to have this exposure to counterparty risk. Okay, so the baseline is that you want to minimize payer variability, but sometimes you need to expose investors to risk, and sometimes, sorry, you want to do it. Last thing I want to say before we get to the meat of the optimal contract, this formulation also allows us to tease out the difference between a multilateral and a bilateral contract. So first, in a multilateral contract with a CCP, you can use CCP capital, right? So this is the first distinction. More important, with a multilateral contract, if your counterparty fail, you're not necessarily left with the collateral. Why? Because other payers can actually make up for your loss, right? This is what we call loss mutualization. You would face a loss from your counterparty, but other payers can come up and transfer resources to you to reduce that loss, right? So this loss mutualization is the key difference between a multilateral contract and a bilateral contract. All right, so now what we're going to do is that I'm first going to tell you about the optimal contract with observable monitoring. Yes, there was a question maybe?
If we can pause, and there is an active discussion going on in the chat about the liquid, risky liquid collateral and the distinction. I'm not sure if Pete or Evangelos would like to comment before we go to the optimal contract description.
So I'll comment. I was raising the question that you can post a liquid collateral, and sometimes illiquid collateral, even if it's risky, has very good risk characteristics as far as the contract is concerned. And I use the example of posting gold as collateral for a short position in gold futures contract. It'll move, you know, the correlation reduces the risk and makes it better collateral in some sense than cash. There's another issue of the clearinghouse trying to liquidate a defaulting member quickly and then paying off, I guess, the other clearing members quickly. And even though they say they do this, it's not clear that's optimal. It might be better to wait. And certainly, if you post these assets that are have negative correlation, the fire sale issue might work to your advantage.
Right. No, so I think it's both are very good points. So I mean, I totally agree with you that theoretically, like nothing would restrict posting, you know, collateral that with high returns, or where you don't bear this kind of liquidity costs. So I think we might have to double check again with John, but our impression is that in many CCPs, like let's say the set of collateral that you can post, of asset that you can post as collateral is still fairly limited. Then on your second point, I totally agree that you probably want to post some to post as collateral some asset that is negatively correlated with the risk of that the members impose on the CCP. So our model is too crude to capture this, because basically the cost of, you know, liquidating collateral is fixed, right? And it doesn't depend on anything. This is this parameter K that I talked about, but I think there are certainly interesting you know, extensions if we want to refine a bit this analysis. Yeah, points well taken.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
So Pete, thanks for the comment. On the correlation part, I agree that is a good risk characteristics for you to use as collateral. But within the context of model, this is exactly why it is so costly. The members that we signing contracts here is he wants to consume in a particular state. And the collateral that you're suggesting is expensive for them because they actually need to consumption in that state. So I think we have to do more analysis, formally address this point. But I think this can be done in the model. The reason they want to sign these gold futures, as you said, is because they want to consume in a certain date. And if they provide that kind of collateral, it would be extremely costly for them. But that's an interesting point we should think about.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, John. Actually, John is even more awake than I am, or is more optimistic about the potential of the model. That's good. All right. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm first going to tell you about the optimal contract under observable monitoring, and in a sense that will be useful to kind of get the economics here of our result. Then what we're going to do is that we're going to switch on the monitoring friction, and this will allow us to get additional results in terms of implementation about the design of the CCP. All right, so as I said, first step, optimal contract when monitoring is observable, which means that you do not need to incentivize it. What we show in the paper, I'm not going to give you the detail here, but that in this case, bilateral monitoring is optimal. Each investor monitor his or her counterparty. This also implies that the CCP will be pretty passive. The CCP does not pledge capital, does not get compensated, right? So you can really think here about the CCP as collecting collateral at date 0 and then channeling transfers according to contract terms at date 1. Now, as I said, if monitoring is observable, there is no incentive benefit from exposing investors to counterparty risk, right? So in this case, what we have here is that RS, which is what you get when your counterparty succeeds, will be equal to RF, which is what you get when your counterparty fails, but at least one payer succeeds. In general, we can think about the optimal contract or the optimal degree of loss minimization as a trade-off between the cost of collateral that we've been talking about and the benefits of that collateral. So I'm going to think about it in this XY plane here, where on the x-axis, you actually have X, which is the collateral. And on the y-axis, you have this transfer RF and RS. You can think about that as how much transfer can I sustain with a given amount of collateral. So the first observation is that there's no need to give receivers more than their desired consumption level C hat, right? This is their hedging needs. You don't want and you don't need to give them more than that. Because collateral is costly, it's first useful to think about what is the optimal contract without collateral, right? So here, what you do is that you walk along the y-axis. You don't use collateral. At some point, you have to stop. Why? Because there's this pledgeability problem. If you want to increase transfers, you have to use collateral, right? And this here, this blue area here, will tell you exactly where you cannot go because of the limited pledgeability problem. This expression of exactly this amount here is not so important. I can explain it if somebody wants, but this is not crucial. The crucial thing is that this contract is not collateralized. Okay, so now if you want to give more to receivers, you're going to have to walk along the lower part here of this region, and you will get to a contract where you get C hat in all the states, but the states where all the payers default. We call that contract complete loss mutualization. Now, along this dark green line here, what is the benefit of using collateral? This is this value here, K upper bar, sorry. First, you have nu minus 1, which are the gains from trade, the benefit from hedging, right? This is the gains from hedging endowment across state. Now, in the bracket, you have 3 terms. What are these terms? First, this one here is a self-insurance benefit. If I pledge collateral, I can provide for my own consumption in the state that I like, right? So this is a self-insurance benefit. This 1 minus Q here is an insurance benefit against counterparty risk. 1 minus Q is the probability that my counterparty defaults. The last term here is the pledgeability benefit of collateral. Cash is more pledgeable than the asset, so even when my counterparty succeeds with probability Q, I get this additional pledgeability benefit, right? And I get that as long as I walk on the dark green line up to this diamond-shaped contract here. Now, what you might see here is that at this contract, I'm not fully hedged because I'm still exposed to the risk that all payers default. In that case, what do I get? I showed you before that I get 2 times X, and this 2 times X, as you can see here, is still lower than my hedging need C hat. Okay. Now, what can I do in addition is that I can walk along this light green line here and to get to the square contract, the fully collateralized contract. Now, when I do this, what is the benefit of increasing collateral? Well, this is just insurance against this worst state of the world, this state where all the payers default, right? So what are the benefits then? Benefits from hedging, nu -1, times the probability that all payers default, right? And because default is idiosyncratic in our model, that's why you get this term here, okay? Now, with that, we did all the hard work. So now we can see what the optimal contract looks like. As you can expect, we're going to see that as a function of this cost of collateral. Again, how do we think about this cost of collateral? We already talked about it, but assets that are used as collateral typically have lower return or are costly for you to pledge, as John was saying, compared to the assets that you will typically own. Collateral is very expensive. You're just going to use an uncollateralized contract. That's fairly simple. Now, if the collateral cost falls below this first threshold K upper bar that I talked about, you're going to choose this complete loss mutualization contract that I mentioned before, right? So this contract gives you C hat as a receiver in all states but the joint default state. As I said, you're not yet fully hedged, and if the cost of collateral falls below the second threshold that I showed you, you're going to use a fully collateralized contract that will give you full hedging, right? Now, what is intuitive about this is, of course, the lower the cost of collateral, the more collateral you use and the more hedged you are. Okay? What's maybe not totally obvious here is that unless you're in the middle region between K lower bar N and K upper bar, unless you're there, the optimal contract can be implemented bilaterally, right? Which means that in our framework, there's no need for central clearing and there's no need for a CCP. Okay, let's start with the left part. If the collateral cost is very small, you're going to fully collateralize the contract, sorry. If that's the case, you have no residual exposure to counterparty risk. No exposure to counterparty risk, no need to mutualize the losses. Okay. Now, when the collateral cost is very high, we show that the optimal contract can be implemented bilaterally. In that case, the contract pays you beta, which is the pledgeable income of the asset of your payer, if this counterparty succeeds, and 0 otherwise. In that case, you're fully exposed to counterparty risk, right? But in order to hedge this counterparty risk via loss mutualization, you would need collateral, and collateral is too expensive, so you don't want to go there, right? So again, the CCP in our model of central clearing will only be essential in this middle region. We can also show that this middle region will expand as you increase the number of members as N goes up. Why? Because this threshold moves to the left. What is the intuition? Well, in our model, the benefits of central clearing are to mutualize losses between members. The more members, the higher the benefit from mutualizing losses, and thus the higher the benefits from the CCP. Now, as you can imagine, in the last part of the talk, I'm going to focus on this intermediate region in which the contract is genuinely multilateral and where you want to mutualize losses between members. So I think it's, again, a good time to pause to see if there is question about this first part.
I'm not sure if there are questions. I see there are a couple of comments.
Okay, so maybe I'll let John handle that, and yeah. I mean, again, if somebody just wants to ask
questions. But if there are questions, I just heard somebody, please feel free to jump in.
Okay.
Yeah, so just a brief kind of meta question on the slides here. So just sort of, Carlos, I'm at the World Bank. I don't speak for the bank, but my question to you is on the specific materials being shared here. I understand that this is more on the preliminary side, but is it when the recording gets posted? How should we think about the different slides, and specifically to the content of what you were talking about, and I think what Professor Kyle mentioned on actors' current behavior and how to kind of we'll call it order this model. How should we think about some of the current quote unquote practices as they map into this line, or is this something that we're going to look at going forward?
Okay, so I guess this is a broad question. So you know, in the paper we discuss in more details how, you know, like we can map this contract into what's observed in practice, and we discuss exactly, you know, basically if you want, you know, I can tell you something very quickly about the mapping. In our model, you have collateral. In practice, you have initial margin and guarantees to the default fund, right? No, I guess there might be, you know, a second part of your question is, you know, how does this model relate to what's being done in practice? And actually, I will come back to that at the end when I will tell you that we can capture some elements of the CCP design that are out there, but we also have some implications about why there might be some features that are optimal or suboptimal. But yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't, you know.
No, that's
get to the
perfect.
question.
No,
Okay.
that's perfect. I just want to make sure that we're going to cover it at some point, and it's not something that we started ex ante when you were mapping things, because it went a little bit, yeah. That's why I asked about the access to the slides, so that I make sure. Yeah, thank you.
Welcome. Yeah, so I see there are two other questions, I guess.
I think it was Wen Yuan and then Albert. So why don't you just ask your questions?
Hi, Vincent. This is Vincent. So can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Vincent. I can hear you.
Hey, yeah, thanks. So I have a question about the netting benefit of central clearing. So when you say that when the collateral cost is high, then actually it's more beneficial for the agents to sign bilateral contracts. But if you think about the netting benefit of central clearing, then maybe in the region when collateral cost is high, the netting benefit can reduce the collateral cost for each individual agent. So in that sense, central clearing can be more preferable. Have you considered that possibility?
So I think that's a very good point. We didn't think about it directly, but I do agree with your point. So what I can say is that, yes, netting is important in CCPs. The reason we focus on this loss mutualization feature is because we think this is the most informative about, you know, if you want to think about the design of the CCP, and in particular some features that you're going to see, and or maybe that you already saw on the next slides. So yes, I totally agree with you, and I guess we will have to think of how we integrate this netting benefit and how do they inform the overall debate about the CCP default waterfall and the capital structure. But thank you, point well taken.
Yeah, this is Albert Menkveld. I had the same thought, the netting. So I'm not sure. I totally agree with you that loss mutualization is more important than netting benefits. Netting benefits, if you look at the sector and what people come up with as the main benefit of a CCP, it's really the ability to net across mutual risk factors. But the way I see, you sort of outscoped it, if I understand your model correctly, because you have one risk. So the way to introduce this is to, I'm not saying that you should do this because it's nice what you have already, but you introduce a second risk factor, and you know, there's another counterparty with whom I had show my second risk factor, and then the extent to which they correlate, and there's, you know, how important netting efficiency is. But I think you're finding a lower bound of the value of the CCP, if I understand everything correctly. Does it make sense?
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you, Albert. And I will certainly not argue against you because you wrote the survey. So, so just to be clear, you know, we're not trying to argue that loss mutualization is more important. It's simply that we feel that for some elements of the design of the CCP, in particular, you will see the part about CCP capital. We think that loss mutualization is let's say more useful to talk about these aspects. I like your idea that we have a lower bound for the value of the CCP. And I should say maybe that the main point of the paper is not to say that, okay, look, CCPs are not so efficient in the end, right? We just want to highlight that, you know, when is this loss mutualization feature useful? And the reason we want to do that is because this business of loss mutualization, we think is useful to think about the design of the CCP. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you.
Okay, it makes sense. Thank you.
And yeah, I guess I should also mention that, you know, I guess most of you know this paper by Darrell and Auk Chung about, you know, netting benefits and why, you know, you might have netting benefits within the CCP. as opposed to netting benefits on a bilateral basis. So I guess that kind of complements this analysis as well. Okay, so thank you very much for the question. So I'm now going to talk about the monitoring friction, and this will give us some more results about implementation. Okay, so very quickly, so far monitoring was observable, and you wanted to do it bilaterally, right? Which meant that there was no active role for the CCP. Now we're going to assume that monitoring is optimal, but it's unobservable. So whoever monitors needs incentives. Suppose first that we still try to do bilateral monitoring. Each investor monitors his or her counterparty. Now, the key intuition here is not very complicated, right? Mutualizing losses means reducing your exposure to your counterparty, which means that you care less about this counterparty, which means that you have less incentive to monitor that counterparty, right? You can see exactly that with this incentive constraint, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to discuss it, right? Again, the intuition is that the point of central clearing in our model is to mutualize losses, so to reduce your exposure to counterparty risk, but that weakens your incentive to monitor that counterparty. What we show in the paper is that if you want bilateral monitoring to be incentive compatible, you need to distort the optimal contract that I showed you. And in particular, you need to reduce the amount of loss mutualization. Okay? Because there's this distortion, you might wonder, is there an alternative scheme that we can consider? Now, the alternative to bilateral monitoring is centralized monitoring by the CCP. Here, the CCP will monitor all the members. Okay? Now, what I want to say is that it's not obvious that this is better, right? In fact, when monitoring is observable, as I told you, although I didn't show it, CCP monitoring is inherently more costly. You don't want to have the CCP as a centralized monitor. Okay. Again, in the interest of time, let me skip the intuition for this result. Now, what is the upside when monitoring is not observable is that you have endogenous economies of scale in monitoring. Okay. This is related to a result that you see in a similar form in Diamond, which is that if the CCP monitors, the agency rent that he gets for monitoring will decrease with the number of investors that are monitored, right? Or the number of members of the CCP. Okay. So from that, very intuitively, you will get that centralized monitoring will tend to dominate bilateral monitoring for large N when there are a lot of members, or for severe monitoring frictions. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this, we think, is that if you look at the compensation contract of the CCP in this case, you will see features that you actually get in CCPs. Okay. Suppose you want the CCP to monitor all the investors. Now, we show that the optimal compensation contract for the CCP is such that the CCP will contribute capital at zero and will get paid if and only if no CCP member defaults, right? Which means that this capital contribution of the CCP is wiped out as soon as you have a default of a member. Now, why is that optimal? Well, this high power contract is the best way to discipline the CCP as a centralized monitor. Some of you might know this result from corporate finance, which is called cross-pledging, right? And in fact, these benefits are higher the more members you have, which is why you have these endogenous economies of scale that I talked about. Now, what about the context of CCP? Well, you can view this contract as a first loss equity tranche for the CCP. Why? Because this capital contribution is wiped out as soon as one member defaults. As I said, the CCP pledges capital, and you can view that as skin in the game. This capital is pledged to make sure that the CCP actually monitors the members. Now, one result that we get in the new draft of the paper, and it's really fresh of the press, but we kind of like this result, is that we find that investors may actually ask too much CCP capital with respect to the social optimum. Okay. What's the intuition here? The members, they require the CCP to post capital in order to capture the agency monitoring rent of the CCP. Okay, so that's optimal for them. Now, the social planner thinks differently. The social planner thinks, what is the cost of using CCP capital? So the CCP planner will face a different trade-off, and the planner will face a different trade-off, and we show that typically the planner will actually require the CCP to post less capital. Okay, so something that maybe many of you have been waiting for. So there was a lot of theory so far. So I want to talk a bit about the empirical relevance of our findings. First, as you saw, we have a theory of the CCP agent as a centralized monitor. Right? You might think, okay, does it make sense in practice? Well, if you read the CCP guidelines or regulatory documents like ESMA, you will see that CCPs do a fair amount of due diligence of their members. This can take place through the form of internal credit classification, on-site visits, or they can even check the book of their members. Okay, that's my alarm. So I guess I'm almost out of time. So something that I really want to focus on is the CCP design part. We say that with this model, we can get the first elements of the default waterfall of the CCP, which is basically the contingency plan if some member defaults. Just like in our model, if a member defaults, that's layer number 1, you will use the collateral posted by this member, right? This is the defaulter pays first principle that you also have in this model. Then the CCP capital has this junior equity tranche, right? That is wiped out as soon as one member defaults. And then after that, you have loss mutualization between surviving members, right? That's layer number 3. As you can see, the reality is much more complex, but we're also already pretty happy that we can capture layers 1, 2, and 3. And as I said previously, we have this result that actually there can be a conflict between the CCP and the members about the size of this capital tranche. Right? All right, so very briefly on the literature, I'm just going to focus on the second bullet point here. There is a growing theory about central counterparty clearing. Papers talking about netting benefits, we focus on loss mutualization benefits. And what we do is that we really provide a theory for the CCP agent and for the CCP capital structure. Okay, so now I'm going to conclude. So what do we have here? A model of central clearing by CCPs, where we focus on the loss mutualization role of the CCPs. What are the key results, or at least the new results? The CCP can emerge as a centralized monitor. And because of that, you want to give the CCP this junior equity tranche for skin in the game. As I said, there's a conflict between members and CCPs about the optimal size of this capital contribution. Members will typically require the CCP to post too much capital. And very briefly to conclude, there's going to be a next version of the paper. And what we do there is that we change the parameter restriction and we allow CCP capital to be used as an insurance tool to insure the members of the CCP. Although this is possible, we're going to show that it's typically suboptimal, right? And what we like about this is that we substantiate the claim by Benoit Curé in a speech at the Chicago Fed. I don't know if he needs the claim to be substantiated, but we still do it. That CCPs are risk poolers, not insurance providers, right? They should pool the risk of their members, not provide insurance to them. And finally, some aspects of future work that we didn't talk about, but we think are very exciting, in particular, the competition between CCPs, and we think our model can help us say something about this. So I think I'm probably even out of time. So I just want to thank you all for the comments, and I'm looking forward to the discussion after the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent. We do have a couple questions, comments in the chat. So Anne here, maybe you want to ask your question yourself? Or I don't know.
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. Hi, Pete. Very nice to see you in this forum. So my comment is really about because most of the other products are having the invariant credit risk. And when it comes to the treasuries market, do you think your benefits of this CCP design sort of is so applicable? And what do you think about what do you think about this type of correlations?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question. Are you talking about central clearing for treasuries trade?
Yeah, for treasury market. Because sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. And I'm from FINRA, and we are raising some kind of comments about because there are certain kind of market participants was proposing if we need to consider central clearing for treasury market because we started to collect this data, and we don't know. We are still wondering, and we would like to have some of your inputs around these lines.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So we know it's a very important and debated question right now. So one thing I want to say is that I guess in our model, we think about derivative contracts in particular because we think about some underlying counterparty risk, right? You have an ongoing transaction and there's some counterparty risk attached to that. I would say that, in spot markets, I guess like treasury markets, treasury trade, you also have some kind of counterparty risk that I guess I would call settlement risk. So again, I think the point is that if you believe that, also in this market, things are driven by this settlement risk, I guess, our findings will be applicable. But I think I'm more knowledgeable about, markets for derivatives where you have it's understood that you have a lot of counterparty risk potentially, as opposed to, just clearing spot trades. I think the trade-offs will maybe be a bit different. I don't know if, maybe John has something smarter to say about this.
I have quickly replied to Anne. I think thanks for the comments. I think if the counterparty risk is really minimal in this market, and you think that the members' default risk is really negligible, then perhaps the benefit of loss specialization we identified in this paper perhaps is not first order, and perhaps it would. I think Albert mentioned netting benefits. I think maybe that would be something more important in that context. But thanks for the comment.
Sure, really appreciate it. We can continue the conversation if all of you had some more time later. Thank you.
Sure, thanks.
Well, as far as I see, there are no specific questions, but Pete had a number of comments, and Wen Chan now has another question. So maybe Wen Chan, and then Pete, if you wanted to continue with the chat comments.
Yeah, thanks. So basically, I like the paper a lot. I mean, I think also your new version improved a lot in terms of the positioning. So yeah, so I think you would it would definitely be a success. I just want to raise the some issues for discussion. So one thing is about this the CCPs as a centralized monitor. I think maybe you could also improve. I mean, you could also add some elements to substantiate that, in the sense that CCPs they are also fine-tuning their model for initial margin. So in that sense, can you say that for the members who have more risky positions, or more concentrated positions, or less creditworthiness, the CCPs would increase the collateral? So in the sense that the collateral requirement is not homogeneous, but they would be differentiated for different products and different counterparties. Because I'm thinking, so maybe just in terms of the product lines, I'm just thinking out loud here, but what would determine the CCP skin in the game in your model? Would the CCP always contribute the same skin in the game, no matter in what kind of, no matter facing what kind of counterparties, or in what kind of product lines, or what kind of market situations? So I think that would be very useful, or even about the membership. I think it would be very useful to sort of see the determination of the CCP capital in your model. What drives that, and that could lead to some empirical implications. I will stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wen-Chan, for these comments. So I think they are very interesting. So let me start by the end. So what determines the amount of CCP capital in our model? So strictly speaking, yeah, that will be this due to this monitoring friction and the fact that the CCP will pledge capital in order to bid away this monitoring rent. So what we can say, as I said here, is that again this capital will be decreasing in the number of members, because the agency rent is decreasing as well, and you need more CCP capital the more severe the monitoring problem. I totally agree with you that we should probably think a bit more about different aspects. So I'm cautious about like different products. I think our model is a bit too stylized for this, but we can certainly think about issues related to the risk of the members and how this would affect the CCP capital requirements. I agree with you that we should maybe push a bit that line. About your first point, which is differentiation, we do think it's really interesting and really important. So I think at first pass, to the extent that what differentiate members is observable, right? I believe you could probably have different collateral requirements for different members, right? And in fact, natural extension will be that an investor that in our model has less pledgeable income could maybe have to post more collateral, right? So this is something that we could maybe think about. I think what's also interesting is that you want to think about differentiation within the CCP as different heterogeneous members within the same CCP, as opposed to maybe different CCPs targeting different kind of members, right? Some kind of market segmentation maybe based on the types of different members or the riskiness of different members. But again, this point is well taken, and of course, we welcome anything that might help us speak a bit more to all the issues that people have in mind with CCPs.
Can I jump in? And Wenchen, thank you very much for the comments. So on top of what Vincent has said, I think one thing that I would think a bit more about that the CCP capital in our model is, in some sense, is a price that the CCP pay for the agency rent. So we can think of what kind of things that drive the rent. And one thing is the end, which is Vincent said, but the other thing would be how tough it is to monitor the agent. So I think it maps kind of what you said. If the counterparty's quality is questionable, that you really have to spend effort in monitoring the members, then the agency rent will go up, and then we should predict the CCP should post more collateral. But we should definitely do more analysis on this comparative statics on the CCP capital. That's very useful. And I like very much on your internal model by CCP calculating margins. Even I just want to add, even if we don't see in the data there is observable heterogeneity in margin requirement, it could be used as a threat by the CCP saying that if you don't do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to increase your initial margin and so on. So this monitoring role is a bit abstract in the model, but we see reports again from ESMA and others saying that they do internal credit ratings and characterizing and monitoring in terms of on-site monitors. So these are the references that we are having right now, but you're right. I think we should do a better job in motivating this monitoring functions of CCP, but thanks.
Thanks a lot.
A very quick follow-up on the monitoring function. So just a little bit of context, right? There's this upcoming push. Will be a huge issuances by the IMF of SDRs of I think something like 650 billion, which is the ceiling in the next few, I think, 14 months. And there's this push of sovereign entities operating in these different liquid secondary markets to change their exposure. SDRs being special drawing rights, and they're probably going to start operating and say it's kind of like trying to change their exposures to different currencies that are part of these special drawing rights. And so I was wondering on this monitoring effort or quantifying this monitoring cost, if there's any chance to think about different types of entities being monitored or different ways of thinking about what exactly is being monitored, if it's a sovereign entity or if it's a financial institution operating in these markets. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I will kind of repeat what John said in that, our monitoring friction and monitoring technologies is fairly stylized. We do think, yeah, indeed, there will be, depending on the creditworthiness of members, and if you think that, sovereigns can be members, like that probably would require less monitoring. So yeah, but I don't think we've thought especially about this issue, but we do understand that yes, this monitoring business, if you think that all the members of the CCP are perfectly creditworthy, they do not need monitoring at all, then yes, for sure, like this monitoring business is likely to be less important. But what we see in these documents is that although the membership requirements are fairly stringent and difficult, there's still, supposed to be some monitoring after that. But again, point taken. If you think monitoring is not useful, then that part of the model will not be there.
I would first of all, I don't speak for the bank. I was actually asking maybe the opposite question of the side of the question. When monitoring cost is so expensive that it's unclear, because how do you monitor an entity the size of a sovereign, right?
Oh, okay. Sorry. No, I get it. Yeah. Yeah, I actually thought about it the opposite way, in the sense that I guess you monitor to the extent that you fear that somebody can default. And I was thinking, well, sovereign are maybe less likely to default than any corporate or any financial institution. So I guess I twist the argument around. But yeah, I agree with you that there's the aspect of the complexity of monitoring counterparty. Yeah, I think that's a valid point, but I'm not sure we our model is equipped to have these kind of subtle differences. But yeah,
so it would unravel the model if there is enough cost on the monitoring side in some sense, right? You have to put a cap.
So one thing I can tell you is that and I was a bit silent on this because yeah, it was a 45-minute presentation, but if monitoring is so costly, in our model we have another tool to take care of counterparty risk, which is collateral, right? Then of course, in practice with collateral, you have the issues that Pete was mentioning, that you need to liquidate it, like there are costs, but if it's going to be so costly to monitor, at some point you're going to switch from monitoring to just requiring people to fully collateralize their position, and then again, taking aside fire sale concerns, you would be safe, let's say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a question from Albert coming up next, but I just wanted to, because we reached the top of the hour, I just wanted to thank you all for coming, and it's like the end of the formal part. And I also wanted to say that we're working on adding 1 or 2 sessions in June, so please stay tuned for the announcements. And now, Albert, the floor is yours.
Yeah, very interesting paper. I wanted to share one thought with you. Only a few weeks ago, I was in a conference of an industry conference, and there was an interesting discussion between CCP managers actually and their risk board. And I was always puzzled by the size of CCP's own equity being so tiny. But then the discussion at that conference made the point, like, look at the compensation of the people at the very top levels of these CCPs. A lot of their compensation is tied up in bonuses that are frozen and and only pay out a few years after nothing's happened. And maybe it doesn't take so much money to get the full benefit of monitoring when you have the right type of people care about these things, and care about these things at the top level of these institutions. Does that make sense? Is that something that you thought about? Thanks again.
Thank you, Albert. Yeah, so I guess what we can highlight in this paper is kind of the comparative statistics as you increase n. So we didn't think about different types of CCP. I totally agree with you that if you put the right people in place, and you might not need so much skin in the game capital to incentivize them. I guess what we wanted to do in this paper is not to give some undue advantage to the CCP as opposed to the individual members, to show that our result can still go through. And of course, like we agree that if you can find people that have the right incentives, and probably you will not need so much skin in the game to incentivize them. And I guess again I'm going to turn to my smarter co-author John to see if he has something to add to this.
Well, thank you, Albert, for the comments and questions. I think one thing that we should do a better job in sort of articulating is basically the level of capital that is contributed in the current form of the paper. It's like the competition, the price that the CCP is offering to get this contract. And you mentioned that for those executives who has all the incentives in the world to make sure nothing happened, they could have a big payment, contingent payment in the future if indeed the CCP is safe. So this is captured partly in our sort of promised compensation to the CCP in the future. But the actual skin in the game that is contributed by the CCP as the capital is something different in some sense. I mean, it depends on this on the cost of the CC capital as well. But the incentive contracts, I'm glad to hear that it is in place, because this is definitely there in the model, and it's not necessarily directly coming through the CCP capital skin in the game. But thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Albert.
I don't see any other raised hands. If there are any other comments or questions, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, once again, thank you very much, Vincent and John, for joining. Great paper. Very good to see you all. Thank you for attending, for questions, for comments. And hopefully we'll see you in June if we do have sessions. So stay tuned for the announcements. But in either case, enjoy your summer.
Thank you very much for having us.